The Pacific, 1945. Fire aboard an aircraft carrier wasn't heroic. It was methodical extinction or total loss. While fighters roared overhead and sailors manned guns below deck, a different kind of battle unfolded in near silence. Engineers with hoses, valves, and temperature gauges fighting flames not with courage but with physics. This is the story of boundary cooling, a firefighting technique so unglamorous it barely made it into official reports, yet so effective it became the unspoken doctrine of damage control teams across the U.S. Navy. No medals were given for opening the right valve at the right time. No speeches celebrated the men who stood in flooded compartments, spraying cold seawater onto steel bulkheads to prevent fire from spreading. But without them, carriers burned. And when carriers burned, the war in the Pacific could shift in an instant. This isn't a story of dramatic rescues or last-second heroics. It's a story of engineers who understood that survival came down to thermal dynamics, disciplined procedure, and the dull, relentless application of water to metal. It's about the moment when one burning compartment, left unchecked, could doom an entire ship, and the quiet ingenuity that stopped it. What follows is the reconstruction of one such event: a carrier struck by enemy fire, a spreading blaze threatening the aviation fuel stores, and a damage control team that chose precision over panic. Their weapon wasn't bravery, it was boundary cooling, and it worked. Chapter 1. March 1945. The carrier had taken a hit just after dawn, a single bomb penetrating the hangar deck, igniting aviation fuel pooled near the arresting gear. The explosion killed 11 men instantly and set fire to 2 parked aircraft. Smoke poured through ventilation shafts. Alarms screamed across every deck. On the bridge, the captain received the first damage report: fire in Hangar Bay 2, spreading aft toward the fuel bunkers. If it reached the storage tanks, the ship would be lost. He gave the order every commander dreaded: activate damage control protocol and prepare to flood compartments if necessary. Below, in the engineering spaces, Lieutenant Morrison, a former industrial boiler inspector from Pittsburgh, was already moving. He didn't run. He walked quickly, methodically, calling out orders to his team as he descended the ladder into the lower decks. His voice was calm, almost bored. Seal hatches forward of frame 60. Route cooling water to bulkheads surrounding Hangar Bay 2. Keep pressure steady at 40 psi. No surges. The men obeyed without question. They had drilled this scenario dozens of times in port, standing in mock compartments while instructors shouted hypothetical disasters at them. Morrison had made them repeat it until it became reflex. Locate the fire, isolate the compartment, cool the boundaries. Boundary cooling. The term sounded academic, almost dismissive. It wasn't about extinguishing the fire directly. That required foam, CO2, or simply starving the flames of oxygen by sealing the space. Boundary cooling was about containment. It meant spraying seawater onto the steel walls surrounding the fire, keeping them cold enough that heat couldn't transfer through the metal and ignite fuel, ammunition, or oxygen stores on the other side. It was boring, tedious, unglamorous, and it saved ships. Morrison reached the damage control station and opened the logbook, scanning the ship's layout. Hangar Bay 2 was surrounded by fuel lines, hydraulic reservoirs, and the aft magazines. If any of those ignited, the explosion would crack the keel. He traced his finger along the bulkhead diagram, calculating which compartments needed cooling first. Get hoses on frames 58, 60, and 62, he said. Start at the top and work down. I want every inch of those bulkheads wet. His team moved into position, dragging heavy canvas hoses through narrow passageways. The ship rolled slightly in the swell, and water sloshed across the deck plates. The smell of smoke was everywhere now, acrid and chemical, seeping through sealed hatches. One of the younger sailors, Ramirez, a machinist's mate from San Diego, hesitated at the hatch leading toward the fire. He could feel the heat radiating through the steel. His hand trembled on the valve wheel. Morrison noticed. He stepped beside him, placed one hand on the hatch, and waited. After a moment, he spoke. It's warm. Not critical. That means the cooling's working on the other side. Open it halfway, route the hose through, then seal it again. You've done this before. Ramirez nodded, turned the wheel, and fed the hose through the gap. Morrison watched the pressure gauge. 40 psi. Steady. Good. The fire was still burning in Hangar Bay 2, but the steel around it was cold, and as long as it stayed cold, the fire couldn't spread. Chapter 2. Inside Hangar Bay 2, the fire roared. Flames climbed the bulkheads, feeding on paint, fabric, and rubber. The two burning aircraft were fully engulfed, their frames collapsing into molten heaps. The temperature inside the compartment had exceeded 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, but on the other side of the steel walls, Morrison's team stood in controlled chaos. Water streamed from their hoses, cascading down the bulkheads in shimmering sheets. Steam rose where the cold seawater met superheated metal, filling the compartment with thick, white fog. The men couldn't see each other clearly. They worked by sound and routine, calling out pressure readings, adjusting nozzles, shifting positions to cover every surface. Their boots sloshed through ankle-deep water. Their uniforms were soaked, heavy with brine. Morrison walked the perimeter, checking each section of bulkhead with his bare hand. He pressed his palm flat against the steel, held it there for 3 seconds, then moved to the next section. Warm, but not burning. Acceptable. He had learned this method from his father, a steam fitter who had taught him that metal tells you everything if you listen. Temperature, stress, failure. It all started with heat. Control the heat, and you control the outcome. Section 12 is climbing, one of the sailors shouted. Bulkhead's too hot to touch. Morrison moved quickly to the section, felt the steel himself, and nodded. Increase flow by 10%. Keep it there until the temperature drops. The sailor adjusted the valve. More water poured onto the bulkhead. Morrison waited, hand pressed against the metal, counting silently in his head. After 30 seconds, the temperature began to fall. Hold that rate, he said. Don't let it spike again. Above them, the fire continued to consume everything inside Hangar Bay 2. The damage control teams on the hangar deck were fighting it directly now, smothering the flames with foam and sealing ventilation ducts to cut off oxygen. It was dramatic, visible work, the kind that appeared in training films and official reports. But down here, in the flooded compartments below, Morrison's team was doing the work that mattered most. They were preventing the fire from becoming a catastrophe. Boundary cooling wasn't about heroism. It was about patience, discipline, the willingness to stand in cold water, spraying a wall, while fire raged inches away on the other side. There were no explosions, no dramatic rescues, just water, steel, and time. Chapter 3. The fire in Hangar Bay 2 burned for 47 minutes before the foam teams finally smothered it. By then, Morrison's crew had been spraying the surrounding bulkheads for nearly an hour, maintaining constant pressure, adjusting flow rates, monitoring temperatures with nothing but their hands and instinct. When the all-clear finally came through the intercom, the men didn't cheer. They simply shut off their hoses, coiled the lines, and waited for the next order. Their uniforms were drenched, their hands were raw, but the fuel bunkers hadn't ignited. The magazines hadn't exploded. The carrier was still afloat. Morrison climbed back up to the damage control station and logged the incident in precise clinical language. Boundary cooling protocol applied to frames 5862. Fire contained to Hangar Bay 2. No secondary ignitions. No casualties in engineering spaces. He didn't mention the fear. He didn't describe the heat bleeding through the steel or the way the younger sailors had trembled when the bulkheads began to glow. Those details didn't belong in the log. Later, in the enlisted mess, Ramirez sat with his coffee and stared at his hands. They were blistered from gripping the hose, red from the cold water. Another sailor asked him what it had been like. "Boring," Ramirez said. "We just stood there and sprayed water on a wall." The other sailor laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Ramirez wasn't joking. That was exactly what they had done, and it had saved the ship. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. Chapter 4. The technique had a name, but most sailors didn't know it. Boundary cooling appeared in Navy damage control manuals as a footnote, a secondary procedure listed after foam suppression and compartment flooding. It was taught during training, demonstrated once or twice with diagrams and temperature charts, then largely forgotten, until it wasn't. Morrison had learned it during his civilian years, working in industrial plants where boiler fires were a constant risk. The principle was simple: prevent heat transfer by cooling the surfaces adjacent to the fire, keep the steel cold, and the fire stays contained. Let the steel heat up, and the fire spreads through conduction, igniting everything on the other side. It was physics, not bravery. And physics didn't care about courage. When Morrison joined the Navy in 1942, he was assigned to damage control because of his engineering background. He expected to fight fires with foam and extinguishers the way it was shown in recruitment posters. Instead, he found himself teaching sailors how to read temperature, how to calculate heat transfer rates, how to prioritize which bulkheads needed cooling first. It's not about putting out the fire, he told them during drills. It's about making sure the fire stays where it is. You're not firefighters. You're containment engineers. The sailors didn't like that explanation. It sounded too passive, too indirect. They wanted to charge into burning compartments with hoses blazing, to save lives and extinguish flames. Spraying water on a wall didn't feel like fighting, but Morrison insisted. He made them practice until they could route hoses in the dark, until they could adjust pressure by sound alone, until they understood that the dullest task in the Navy might also be the most critical. And when the carrier took that hit in March 1945, his training proved correct. The fire in Hangar Bay 2 was fought by two teams, one inside the compartment, smothering flames with foam, and one outside, cooling the boundaries to prevent spread. The first team got the recognition. The second team got the ship home. Chapter 5. Not every carrier was saved by boundary cooling. Some burned because the technique was ignored, because officers prioritized direct suppression over containment, because crews panicked and abandoned their posts. Morrison had heard the stories. He knew about the carrier that lost half its crew when a fire spread through unsealed bulkheads. He knew about the ship that sank after flames reached the fuel bunkers because no one thought to cool the surrounding compartments. He also knew that those stories were rarely told in full. Official reports mentioned catastrophic fire or uncontrolled spread, but they didn't explain why. They didn't say that boundary cooling had been skipped, that the procedure was considered too slow, too boring, too unglamorous. It was easier to blame bad luck. Easier to say the fire was too intense, the damage too severe. Easier than admitting that survival sometimes required patience instead of heroics. After the fire in Hangar Bay 2, Morrison submitted a detailed report to the ship's executive officer, outlining the boundary cooling procedure and recommending that it be emphasized in future training. The XO read it, nodded, and filed it with the other damage reports. No commendations were issued. No changes were made to the training curriculum. The sailors who had sprayed water on bulkheads for an hour received no recognition beyond a brief mention in the captain's daily log. But Morrison didn't expect recognition. He had done his job. The ship was still afloat. That was enough. Still, he wondered how many other ships might have survived if their crews had understood what he understood, that the most effective defense against fire wasn't foam or CO2 or flooding. It was cold water on steel. It was boundary cooling. It was boring. And it worked. Chapter 6. The Pacific Campaign continued. The carrier returned to operations after 2 days of repairs, rejoining the fleet for strikes against enemy-held islands. The fire in Hangar Bay 2 became another entry in the ship's log, another incident among hundreds. But for Morrison and his team, something had shifted. They had proven that their method worked, not in a drill or a classroom, but under real combat conditions. The younger sailors, who had once complained about the tedium of spraying bulkheads, now understood the purpose behind it. Ramirez, the machinist's mate who had hesitated at the hatch, became one of the most disciplined members of the damage control team. He practiced routing hoses in his off hours, memorized the layout of every compartment, learned to estimate bulkhead temperatures by touch alone. "Why do you care so much?" another sailor asked him one evening. Ramirez didn't answer immediately. He thought about the moment when he had felt the heat radiating through the steel, the moment when Morrison had placed his hand on the same hatch and shown him that it wasn't critical, that the cooling was working. "Because it's not about being brave," he finally said. "It's about being right, and being right keeps people alive." The other sailor shrugged, unconvinced, but Ramirez didn't need him to understand. He knew what he had learned in that flooded compartment, standing in cold water while fire burned inches away. He had learned that survival wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was methodical, sometimes it was boring, and sometimes boring was the only thing that worked. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how humanity can survive even inside the walls of captivity. Chapter 7. The war ended in August 1945. The carrier returned to San Diego, where it was decommissioned and eventually scrapped. Morrison left the Navy and returned to Pittsburgh, where he went back to inspecting boilers and teaching industrial safety. He never spoke much about the fire in Hangar Bay 2. When people asked about his service, he gave brief, factual answers. Damage control officer, Pacific Theater, no major incidents. But sometimes late at night, he would think about those 47 minutes. He would remember the sound of water hitting steel, the steam rising in thick clouds, the way his hand had felt pressed against the bulkhead, counting seconds, measuring heat. He would remember Ramirez trembling at the hatch, then steadying himself and opening the valve. He would remember the other sailors soaked and exhausted, maintaining pressure for an hour straight without complaint. He would remember that they had saved the ship, not with bravery, but with discipline, not with heroics, but with physics. And he would wonder if anyone else remembered, if anyone else understood that the most important battles were often the most invisible. Chapter 8. Decades later, a naval historian researching damage control procedures during World War II came across Morrison's report in the archives. It was buried among thousands of other documents, a single typewritten page describing the boundary cooling protocol used during the fire in Hangar Bay 2. The historian recognized its significance immediately. Boundary cooling had become standard practice in modern naval firefighting, but its origins were poorly documented. Most training manuals attributed it to wartime innovations without naming specific incidents or individuals. Morrison's report was one of the few that described the technique in detail, explaining not just what was done, but why it worked. The historian contacted Morrison, who was then in his 70s, and asked if he would be willing to discuss the incident. Morrison agreed, though he seemed puzzled by the interest. "It wasn't anything special," he said during the interview. "We just did what the manual said. We cooled the bulkheads to prevent spread. It's basic physics." The historian pressed him. "But it saved the ship. Without boundary cooling, the fire would have reached the fuel bunkers." Morrison paused. "Maybe, but we were just doing our jobs. There's no story there, just procedure." The historian disagreed. He believed there was a story about how the unglamorous, invisible work of engineers and technicians had been just as critical as the pilots and gunners who received all the recognition. But Morrison never saw it that way. To him, boundary cooling wasn't heroic. It was just the right thing to do, the boring thing, the thing that worked. Chapter 9. The fire in Hangar Bay 2 burned for less than an hour. The boundary cooling that contained it took slightly longer. In the decades since, the technique has saved countless ships, prevented innumerable casualties, and become standard doctrine in naval damage control training. But the men who first proved its effectiveness under combat conditions received no medals, no commendations, no recognition beyond a brief entry in a ship's log that was eventually archived and forgotten. Morrison died in 1998, a retired boiler inspector who spent his final years teaching industrial safety courses. He never sought recognition for his service. He never claimed to be a hero. He was right not to. What he and his team did aboard that carrier in March 1945 wasn't heroism. It was competence, it was discipline. It was the dull, relentless application of cold water to hot steel. It was boring, and it saved lives. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden stories of World War II, stories of resilience, memory, and redemption. Thank you for watching.